David pulled up to the old house as the last rays of sunset painted the overcast sky a sore, bruising purple. A looming shadow seemed to darken the peeling siding and creaking porch boards even further in the dim light. Turning off the engine, he sat for a long moment, hands gripping the wheel as the chill of creeping dusk seeped into the car. Something about the shadows lurking here gave him pause, but he'd come too far to reconsider now. This isolation was what he needed, wasn't it? With a sigh, David heaved himself out into the stiff breeze whistling through barren trees. Gravel crunched underfoot as he made his way to the trunk, fishing out a flashlight and small duffel bag containing a change of clothes and some canned food. The house groaned as he pushed open the towering front door into near total darkness. His beam swept over a thick layer of dust, coating every surface like a shroud. Abandoned furnishings hulked misshapen in the murk. Despite the musty air sending a wave of nausea through him, David steeled himself and ventured further inside. A creak echoed from somewhere deep within as he climbed the stairs, as if the house were rousing from a long slumber to greet its new tenant. Upstairs held 2 bedrooms and a cramped bathroom, all as painfully cold and unused as the rest of the place. After dropping his bag in the smaller of the bedrooms, David retreated downstairs, flashlight bobbing erratically as panic constricted his chest. This was a mistake. He shouldn't have come. No, he told himself firmly. This was what the doctors had prescribed: solitude, distance from the familiar, time and isolation to heal, as if such a thing were possible. Forcing steadying breaths, David paced the main floor but could find no source of heat or electricity. In the gloom, shadows seemed to pulsate and shift unnaturally at the edges of his perception. A pervasive sense of being watched crawled over his skin. In his mounting anxiety, David stumbled into a narrow door left ajar, flashlight beam trembling over stone steps leading into murkier depths. The basement, then. If he was going to stay, he'd have to make this place habitable, no matter the crawling sense of dread pooling in his gut. Step by shuddering step, he descended into the dank cellar. Dust motes danced in his beam, almost seeming to shiver and part as if alive. Bottles, boxes, and broken furniture were strewn haphazardly amid cobwebs thicker than gauze. A glint from the far corner caught his eye. Brushing aside a tattered sheet revealed an antique mirror, ornate yet tarnished with age. Through the foggy glass, his gaunt reflection stared back, dark circles emphasizing haunted eyes that did not belong to him. A noise split the silence, a skitter or stir from the unseen edges of the mirror's frame. Something had moved there, just out of sight. David froze, straining to pierce the shadows, stretching endlessly behind the glass. Nothing. His mind was playing tricks, feeding on mounting fears in this wretched place. Still, as David fled upstairs and barred the basement door, an irrational terror lingered that something had been watching back, and it was not through his own eyes. That night, restless dreams clawed at David's fitful sleep. He found himself in a maze of cracked mirrors that warped and leaned at impossible angles, reflecting shattered versions of himself going mad. Down one corridor, he came upon glass stained dark as ink, but sensed something staring out from the other side. Scrambling away in panic, David crashed through a mirror into pitch nothingness. He awoke with a start, coated in a sheen of cold sweat despite the chill. Pale moonlight filtering through cracks in the boarded windows provided scant illumination, yet shadows seemed denser than before. Every creak and groan of the old house sent a jolt down his spine. After hours of tossing unable to sleep, David laid eyes on the flashlight sitting atop his bag like an accusation. Down in the basement lurked answers to his torment, or so he told himself as he crept silently down the skeletal stairs before dawn. The basement felt even more sepulchral in the small hours, yet David was determined this time. Brushing aside cobwebs, he located the mirror and switched on his light with a shaking hand. It was as he left it, or was it? A creeping dread told him something had shifted, though all appeared perfectly as found. David drew closer, breathing ragged, and his breath caught in horror. There, outlined faintly in the fogged glass, was the unmistakable silhouette of a second figure standing just behind him. Whirling with a strangled cry, David found only his solitary reflection staring wide-eyed back at him in the emptiness. Heart battering his ribs, David grabbed the mirror's frame with a vice-like grip, heaving with all his might. It toppled from the wall with a crash, glass scattering across the floor like a crazed kaleidoscope. Kneeling amid the shards, David searched desperately through the wreckage, but saw only fractals of himself, pale with panic. Nothing else was there. Yet as his breathing slowed, a soft rustling whisper came from the nearest shadows. "Not real. Not real," David muttered, stumbling back towards the stairs on unsteady legs. His footsteps broke the silence in a maddening syncopation with that subtle stirring in the dark corners of his mind. In a sudden fever, David plunged his hands into the icy well water, scrubbing obsessively to rid himself of imagined filth. Returning inside dripping and blue-lipped, he collapsed into an exhausted doze as dawn's first rays filtered in. David spent the day boarding up cracks and lighting the fireplace with numb precision, as if physical labor could tire out his demons. But within minutes of resting, they returned with a vengeance, prodding at memories long buried. Images flashed unbidden, his ex-lover's tear-stained face as their relationship collapsed under the weight of David's turmoil. Harsh words exchanged in the heat of arguments, while deeper wounds festered unseen. A childhood he'd tried so desperately to forget. Now it all swirled together in a poisonous memory soup, dredging up feelings better left drowned at the bottom of his soul. David clenched his fists until nails drew blood, anything to ground himself in the present. But it was no use. The shadow's whispers grew ever more insidious. That evening, as darkness fell once more, David knew a restless night awaited. He drank himself into a stupor by the fire, each gulp offering temporary oblivion from the horrors haunting both within and without. Passing out beside the hearth, David dreamed of suffocating under an avalanche of broken mirrors, each fragment cutting deeper as phantom hands dragged him down into a sea of his own shattered reflection. He thrashed and screamed silently until jolting awake in a cold sweat once more. Days blurred into an endless nightmare for David as the shadow's hold tightened. His grasp on reality frayed with each new terror, warping his perceptions. Old photographs appeared whenever he turned his back, showing people long dead or places he'd never been. Voices emanated from empty rooms, muttering just below the threshold of comprehension. Dark shapes seemed to lurk at the edge of vision before melting away. David took to barricading himself in during daylight hours, but not even sunlight could banish the horror seeping in. The nights were worst of all, as creeping dread built towards an inevitable climax. That evening, the shadow emerged from the mirror's remains in full force to toy with its prey. David heard manic giggling in the walls and floorboards creak under invisible weight. His candle snuffed out, plunging the room into impenetrable gloom. A chill breath raised the hairs on David's neck, yet when he spun around, he found only darkness. Was he losing his senses, or was something truly there with him in the black? Suddenly, the room was awash in a blinding white light. David squinted against the searing illumination to see himself reflected clearly in all four walls and ceiling, a hall of mirrors enclosing his unraveling psyche. Each David laughed hysterically, voices dissolving into a dissonant cacophony that bored into his skull like buzzing hornets. He collapsed to his knees, clawing desperately at his ears to block out the maddening din. Just as abruptly, the lights died, leaving David gasping in the suffocating dark. A weight descended upon his chest, pinning him as invisible fingers closed around his throat in a crushing grip. Terror seized his frantic mind. He was going to die here, murdered by demons that weren't really there. Something ice-cold traced David's cheek in a mockery of affection before vanishing. Gasping for air, He fumbled in the inky black until his hands closed around the flickering candle, left miraculously intact. Its wavering glow revealed only his lonely bedroom once more. David scrambled into the corner, curling in on himself as guttural sobs racked his trembling form. Nothing was real anymore. He couldn't trust his eyes or ears, didn't know friend from foe or sanity from madness. The shadow had him right where it wanted, lost in a maze of doubt with no escape. David clutched at the hope that dawn would bring respite, but darkness has a way of seeping into the soul where no light can reach. He knew, whatever horrors awaited when slumber took him, there would be no wake from this nightmare until it had destroyed him completely. Sure enough, as David's exhaustion overtook his terror, the dream swallowed him once more. He found himself strapped to a slab, unable to move as masked figures in long black robes cut him open from sternum to gut. Looking on was his reflection from the broken mirror, eyes glittering with cruel delight as it watched David's anguished screams spill forth in endless ribbons of scarlet. David thrashed awake with a scream, spasming violently until retching bile onto the dusty floorboards. His reflection stared back from panels of foggy glass and shattered fragments, wearing a grin too wide for any human face. Haggard eyes met eyes, and David knew, without a shadow of doubt, he was well and truly broken now. The shadow had won. David drifted through the next days like a corpse, unthinking and unfeeling, numb to the shadow's constant torment. His body remained, but inside was only a hollow shell, void of anything but pure animal instincts keeping his heart beating, lungs breathing. Late one night he was jarred awake by a strange warmth blossoming gently in his chest. Looking down, he saw a soft glow emanating from his heart, pale golden light seeping through translucent skin. It resonated with something deep within, kindling a small flicker of hope against the darkness. David slowly became aware of whispered voices all around, though they brought no fear now, only comfort. The lights and presences guided him downstairs where moonbeams shone down through cracks in the boarded windows, illuminating motes of dust like celestial bodies. David watched, enraptured as constellations took shape before his eyes. Orion the hunter emerged among familiar stars, then other great myths, Perseus and Andromeda, Cassiopeia, the twin sphinxes Alcor and Murk guarding Ursa Major. Their wisdom and guidance washed gently through David's mind. He traced the patterns unconsciously with outstretched hands, connecting invisible lines that unlocked forgotten parts of himself. Buried memories surfaced with the stars, but their edges were softened now by peace and understanding. A realization dawned on David as if the heavens themselves had spoken it. He was not alone in his pain or flaws. Suffering was shared by all humanity beneath these eternal lights, and within their vast, uncaring beauty lay absolution for earthly sins and failings. As dawn broke, the shadows retreated before the mirror of David's restored soul. He turned at last to face his final confrontation, heart full to meet whatever form his demons chose to take in their last grasp at power over him. But nothing awaited in that grim cellar, only dust and ruins as a mirror's remnants. David smiled, pity replacing fear, for he knew at last the truth of his own shadow. It was only ever a manifestation of weaknesses he'd refused to acknowledge within. Accepting all parts of his nature, light and dark, joy and pain, allowed David to reclaim his fractured self and emerge whole from the abyss. Though scars may remain, he was freed. As for the whispering remnants haunting those creaking rooms and halls, their power was broken too. David left that forsaken place without looking back, renewed resolve carrying him towards the dawn. Though night still brought unease at ghosts refusing to rest, day by day the stars guided him towards healing the wounds of his past. For the first time since that painful ending, hope lit David's heart that happiness may find him again someday in bright skies ahead.